When contact comes to a halt from both sides, the first thing that often unfolds is a wave of relief, but not the kind of peace that comes from resolution. For someone with a dismissive avoidant attachment style, silence can feel like a return to safety. Communication closeness and emotional expectation can trigger their deeper fears of being controlled, judged, or needed too much. So when messages stop, their nervous system interprets the distance as freedom. The absence of emotional demands creates the illusion that everything is finally back to normal. But this relief doesn't come from clarity, it comes from habit and defense. Avoidants have trained themselves to associate connection with risk and distance with stability. During this phase, they aren't typically processing the relationship or the silence the way you might imagine. Instead, they compartmentalize, often shifting focus to work, hobbies, distractions, or solo routines. They convince themselves that isolation equals strength and independence equals emotional correctness. Yet beneath this structured calm, there's a quiet shutdown at play. They don't acknowledge the loss because acknowledging it would mean confronting discomfort. That discomfort could be guilt, abandonment, fear, vulnerability, or suppressed longing, feelings they were never wired to sit with directly. This withdrawal isn't always intentional or malicious. It's self-protection disguised as indifference. When contact fades, it confirms their belief that closeness is optional and distance is harmless. The silence feels safe because it avoids the possibility of misunderstanding, conflict, emotional exposure, or obligation. In their mind, no contact doesn't mean something is wrong, it means there's nothing to manage. This is why their initial silence can seem so final, even when it isn't. However, the sense of relief isn't sustainable. It's more like a temporary emotional freeze. The avoidance of reflection creates a delay in their emotional timeline. While you may feel the impact of the silence immediately, they often feel nothing at first because they've numbed the part of themselves that would notice. Their version of calm isn't peace, it's suppression. They may even rationalize the gap by framing it as mutual disinterest, compatibility, enlightenment, or proof that everything is fine. Their internal dialogue sounds like, if no one reached out, then it must not matter, or this is easier for both of us. But emotional shutdown doesn't erase emotional attachment, it only delays it. The initial relief is not the end point, it's the escape hatch they rely on when closeness becomes confronting. Over time, distance can create its own kind of pressure, but in the beginning, that silence feels like oxygen to someone who fears being overwhelmed. When the communication stops from both sides, your internal world doesn't go quiet just because the outside has. There's often a strange mix of confusion, longing, self-restraint, and emotional noise that unfolds in layers. Even if you were the one who chose to stop reaching out, your mind still tries to make sense of the silence. You might start by rationalizing the distance, telling yourself you're doing the right thing. That holding back is a form of self-respect, that initiating contact again would only restart the cycle. But beneath that logic, there can be a restless pull, a desire for clarity, acknowledgement, or even just a sign that your absence was felt. What makes this phase so emotionally disorienting is the contrast between your thoughts and your behavior. On the surface, you're saying nothing, doing nothing, holding your ground. But internally, questions surface in flashes. Was the silence expected? Do they even care? Are they relieved, indifferent, curious, or just as conflicted? The lack of response from the other person amplifies your own inner voice, sometimes to the point of overthinking. You try to read into memories, last conversations, or the tone of the final interaction, searching for unspoken meanings or signs you might have missed. There can also be a tug of war between wanting closure and wanting connection. Part of you may crave a message that proves there was something meaningful on their end. Another part might feel stronger staying silent, not to play games, but to preserve whatever dignity or peace you've managed to build. And yet, emotional stillness is hard when your attachment has been activated. The longing can show up in subtle ways, checking your phone without realizing, replaying scenarios in your head, or waking up thinking about what you would say if contact resumed. This inner energy doesn't always feel like sadness. Sometimes it feels like uncertainty, restlessness, or even unexpected calm that confuses you. The lack of communication can create a vacuum where your habits, routines, and mental focus start to shift. Some days you feel pulled backward, missing the attention, the familiarity, or the emotional hope you held on to. Other days you feel a release, a kind of breathing room that reminds you how heavy it was to constantly wait, try, or interpret their behavior. As days pass, the silence begins to shape your self-perception. You might start assessing your own emotional boundaries more clearly. You may recognize how much mental space you'd given them and how much of yourself got lost in trying to understand them. Even if the longing or confusion stays present, you begin to see your role in the attachment dynamic from a different angle. The absence forces introspection because there's no external interaction to distract you. You start to ask deeper questions about what you want, what feels balanced, what you're willing to tolerate, and how much emotional labor you've silently carried. This phase isn't about pretending not to care. It's about navigating the space between what you felt and what you're choosing not to act on. The disorientation comes from adjusting to that gap where your emotions still move, but your actions don't follow. Over time, that gap becomes the place where you start to reclaim your energy, not because the feelings disappear instantly, but because you slowly stop feeding them with pursuit, explanation, or expectation. When both people stop reaching out, something subtle but powerful starts to unfold. Control over the dynamic suddenly becomes neutralized. Silence is no longer one-sided, and that alone shifts the energy. When only one person pulls back, the other often ends up in a position of waiting, wondering, or chasing. But when neither initiates contact, the balance resets without words or confrontation. What makes this moment so psychologically intense is not what's said, but what isn't. No one is leading, no one is reacting, and no one is feeding the loop of emotional stimulus. The absence of exchange invites observation, but neither side knows what the other is truly thinking, feeling, or expecting. This kind of silence creates a space where curiosity and uncertainty begin to grow. Each person becomes aware, consciously or not, that there is now no obvious reason for contact to resume. There's no argument being resolved, no conversation being continued, and no closure being offered. The quiet becomes a blank space that both sides can project meaning onto. And that's where internal questioning starts. One may assume indifference from the other, but that assumption can clash with memories, past signals, or the energy once invested. Another might feel tempted to break the silence just to regain narrative control, but the equal stillness of the other person blocks that impulse. Neither side wants to reveal vulnerability first, so the stalemate deepens. There's also a psychological tension that emerges when communication stops without resolution. With no clear ending, the mind tries to fill in the blanks. You may wonder whether the other person is trying to prove something, protect themselves, or simply doesn't care. At the same time, you start to reflect on your own silence, whether it's strength, uncertainty, self-preservation, or pride. Because neither person is signaling interest or disinterest, assumptions can become louder than reality. That's where introspection begins almost unintentionally. You start thinking about what the silence means instead of what the relationship meant. This mutual pause can create an invisible mirror. Without conversation as a buffer, each person confronts their own behavior, needs, and emotional thresholds. The lack of external feedback opens up an internal audit: why you responded the way you did in the past, what patterns played out, and what you actually want moving forward. But this reflection doesn't always show up calmly. For some, it manifests as impatience, ego, or silent testing, waiting to see who gives in first. For others, it's a quiet scan of past dynamics: who initiated more, who avoided more, who tolerated more, and who withdrew to regain certainty. Even if neither person admits it, the silence becomes an unspoken message. It says no one is chasing, no one is rescuing, no one is clarifying. That lack of movement forces both to confront their relationship to contact itself, whether it was used to soothe, control, validate, or distract. Eventually, the silence either becomes empowering, unsettling, or revealing, depending on what each person was protecting with their previous communication. When communication cuts off from both sides, the dismissive avoidant doesn't immediately start processing the emotional reality of the situation. Their mind is wired to delay emotional engagement, not because they don't care, but because caring feels risky, unfamiliar, or inconvenient. In the beginning, they lean on distance the way others lean on connection. Silence gives them psychological cover. No demands, no questions, no vulnerability. But as time passes and nothing is exchanged, their usual distractions don't entirely cancel out the quiet signals that surface beneath the surface. Avoidants don't process emotions in direct, conscious bursts. They experience feelings in slow, disconnected fragments that creep in through routine, memory, or unexpected triggers. Something as minor as a place, a song, a familiar time of day, or a pause in their schedule can cause a flicker of awareness. They may not label it as missing someone. Instead, it shows up as restlessness, intrusive thoughts, or fleeting questions they push away before they fully form. Their first instinct is to rationalize those moments. They tell themselves it's just habit, boredom, or random thought. But the mind doesn't send signals without reason, and over time, those signals repeat. Because they rely on emotional suppression, realizations rarely appear as clear insights. They don't sit down and think, why hasn't there been contact? They feel something shift in smaller increments. An itch of curiosity, a moment of nostalgia, a subtle comparison when they meet someone new. The silence that once felt protective can slowly turn into space where their thoughts have room to echo. They won't admit it out loud, but the absence begins to register in their nervous system before it registers in their logic. Their delayed processing often looks like emotional lag. While you might have already navigated the initial confusion, reflection, or pain right away, their timeline runs behind yours. They don't feel the weight of the silence until much later, and even then, they rarely connect it to unmet attachment needs. Instead, they may reframe it as wondering what you're doing, thinking about reaching out without acting on it, or imagining your reaction if they did. They protect their ego and autonomy by avoiding any thought that implies they were affected, but the mind doesn't obey denial forever. In some cases, the lack of contact challenges their assumptions. If they believed you would eventually reach out and you don't, the silence forces them into a new emotional territory they don't know how to navigate. That shift doesn't always lead to action, but it does create internal movement, a quiet dissonance they can't fully dismiss. Their realizations come not through emotional confrontation, but through the slow erosion of their certainty. Over time, distance becomes less of a shield and more of a mirror, reflecting back what suppression tried to hide. When the communication stops on both ends, something begins to realign inside you, not always immediately and not always cleanly, but steadily. Without the cycle of reaching out, waiting for replies, managing expectations, or decoding mixed signals, your emotional energy starts to pull back into your own center. At first, it may not feel like empowerment. You might still think about them, check your phone, replay conversations, or wonder if breaking the silence would change anything. But beneath that noise, the absence of contact creates a shift. The energy that once extended outward has nowhere else to go but inward. You begin to notice things you couldn't see clearly while you were emotionally engaged. The moments you justified, the effort you gave, the imbalance you tolerated, all of it becomes more visible when you're not actively trying to maintain a connection. The silence gives you contrast. You start realizing how much of your mental space was occupied by trying to understand someone else's detachment. What once felt like longing may begin to feel like exhaustion when you see it from a quieter headspace. That recognition alone is a form of self-protection waking up. As the days continue, your focus naturally shifts toward your own needs, sometimes unintentionally. You might dive into routines, friendships, work, or solitude in a way that doesn't feel as heavy anymore. Even when thoughts of them appear, they no longer command the same urgency. The silence disrupts the emotional habit of pursuit or anticipation, and that gap becomes room for you to breathe. You begin to ask different questions, not will they come back, but why was I giving so much? Not do they miss me, but what do I actually need from someone who claims to care? That reframe is subtle but powerful, and it happens without forcing it. Your sense of worth also starts recalibrating. When you're no longer expending energy trying to be seen, chosen, or understood, you slowly reconnect to parts of yourself that were overshadowed by emotional effort. You may feel sadness, anger, or calm at different times, but those emotions start orienting around you, not them. The quiet pulls you toward reflection, and reflection pulls you towards self-recognition. You may even begin to appreciate the stillness you once feared, because it no longer feels like abandonment. It feels like space to recover your identity. Over time, the desire to reach out loses its grip, not because you stop caring entirely, but because you start caring about yourself more. You don't have to force detachment or pretend strength. The absence itself begins to teach you where your boundaries should have been and where your energy belongs. The silence doesn't just separate you from them, it reunites you with yourself. When both sides go quiet, the future of the connection doesn't freeze. It quietly branches into possibilities, even if no one speaks them aloud. The absence of contact becomes a test neither person agreed to, but both participate in. The silence isn't just empty space, it's a slow reveal. With time passing and no outreach from either side, the situation starts to clarify the emotional truth in ways words never could. One path is quiet closure. Without messages, reminders, or emotional friction, the bond can simply loosen with time. There's no dramatic ending, no confrontation, no final argument, just a gradual emotional fade. You start to detach, not because you made a bold decision, but because nothing is feeding the attachment anymore. You accept the stillness, not out of resentment, but because your energy has naturally redirected inward. In that space, you may recognize that the connection ran on hope and habit more than reciprocity. Letting go becomes less of a decision and more of a quiet acceptance. Another path is renewed curiosity, often delayed, especially on the avoidance side. They may not feel the emotional distance immediately, but the longer the silence stretches, the more unfamiliar it becomes. If they were used to you reaching out or holding the emotional thread, your absence can eventually trigger thought patterns they don't expect. They might not name it longing, but they may think of checking your social media, revisiting old messages, or mentally rehearsing what they'd say if they reached out. But because avoidant processing happens slowly and indirectly, this curiosity doesn't always translate to immediate action. Still, the possibility of reconnection starts forming in their mind, even if they try to suppress it. The third outcome is a suspended middle ground, a kind of unfinished pause. Neither fully detached, neither reconnected, both aware that something could still shift given the right trigger. This is the space where silence keeps both people observing without committing. For you, it might feel like neutrality paired with occasional what-ifs. For them, it may feel like unresolved energy they refuse to name. In this in-between, a message could change the trajectory, but neither side wants to break the balance first. Regardless of the direction, the silence acts as a quiet filter. It shows what survived without effort and what existed only because you kept nurturing it. If they reach out later, it's not because you pressured them, because the distance created space for their thoughts to catch up. If they don't, the closure settles on its own timeline without begging, chasing, or forcing clarity. In every case, what happens next unfolds not in the noise of dialogue, but in the truths exposed by the absence of it.